Hello my sandy friends. Today's video will be on lens number 8, the use of vertical space in the sand tray. Here we can consider the elevation of the actual sand tray above the floor, as well as what happens within the sand tray, the heights, the elevations. Is there anything flying above the sand tray? Yes, we can make things fly, and we'll talk about some of the practicalities of that. Let's talk about whether we should position the sand tray on the floor or on elevation, on a table, for example. Young children almost always choose to work on the floor. That's natural for them. If at all possible, you should ideally be sitting on the same level, but obviously if your back and knees do not allow you to do so, try to be as close to their level as you can, but obviously without causing yourself any unnecessary pain. Adults who choose to work on the floor may potentially have easier access to that childlike state, that playfulness, and possibly also to their vulnerability. So for an adult to work on the floor may feel quite different from working on the raised surface. But obviously for many adults it may be uncomfortable, inconvenient, or painful to get on the floor, so definitely have some options of having the tray raised on the table or on a taller wheeled trolley. So, but ideally give them an option if you can. Some of my sand trays which I put on the floor have a wheeled workman's trolley underneath them, which makes them easier to move. But beware, it can be quite easy to tip the tray if you lean onto the edge of it, so that's one disadvantage. So decide whether the sand tray is raised or closer to the floor, depending on your client, and give them a choice if you can. As you witness the client create their sand tray, you can observe their use of vertical space. For example, is the sand level, more or less, or are there significant height differences? So there might be some mountains or dips, hills, and obviously it's easier to create those height variations in wet sand, but they may also be noticeable in dry sand as well. So you may find that some symbols are quite similar in height, or there might be significant height variations. There might be some very tall symbols, assuming you have those in your collection, and some may be very short. You may find ladders and staircases and other types of steps in the sand tray. They're symbolically quite significant, and we'll talk about that in a short while. Sometimes the client will have things flying above the tray, hopefully not literally throwing things, but a child might often fly, a superhero or a vehicle or a bird above the tray. Or possibly if you have a hook or a hanger where symbols can be attached to hang a little bit above the surface of the sand. That's another option to create flight. Or metaphorically, there may be implied flight if there are birds or flying insects, or flying machines or superheroes in the tray. You may find sometimes the client will position a symbol on the edge of the tray, so it's a little bit elevated above the surface of the tray itself, and again that can potentially have its own significance. There is also examples of de-elevation. Sometimes you will find human or animal figures positioned lying down rather than standing up, and that is always interesting, so make note of that. If a figure which is supposed to be standing up is lying down instead. And of course you can spot if anything is buried in the sand, and we'll talk about buried objects in one of the future lenses. I think it's lens number 9. You may find that your client is expressing a wish for a symbol to be raised higher or to be taller, or maybe even to fly. Can you, or do you know how to, and will you accommodate their wish? For example, by making a suggestion or providing a hanger, or maybe even offering your services to fly something above the tray. So depending on the way you work, you may or may not support your client in these wishes. And if you do want to comment or ask questions in relation to the client's use of vertical space, as always, please consider whether it's safe, relevant and appropriate, as it will not be in all of the cases. Just some practical ideas of how you can support clients to work with heights, with vertical space. Those freestanding hangers or hooks, they're designed for hanging bananas or cups, and they're fantastic to enable the client to fly some of the symbols. For example, this Peter Pan on one of those hangers in this picture. It's really handy to have some blue tack or white tack available. Sometimes when the client wants to place a symbol on the edge of the sand tray, it can get a bit wobbly, sometimes it can fall off. So if they want to secure it well on the edge of the sand tray, blue tack or white tack are excellent resources for that. I find it's really useful not to have all your symbols uniform, but to have some really large, tall ones, obviously the ones that fit into the sand tray still, and some tiny ones. And then the client can create that contrast in heights or sizes when it's needed for them. And it's also really useful to have some type of building blocks or bricks or stones or something that the client can pile up on one on top of another to create a tall tower or another tall structure if they wanted to. I'll say a few words about symbolism of vertical space positioning. Something that's elevated or de-elevated may be connected to the perceived status of that symbol, of that aspect of the client that they placed in the sand tray. Almost universally in all cultures, something that's elevated, something that's high, is deemed to be good, higher status. I'm going up in the world, feeling high, and lower status is associated with being low, being down in the dumps. Heaven is above, hell is below. So higher up and lower down is almost invariably, consciously or unconsciously, is assigned its status, high or low status. If somebody uses very tall or large figures very regularly in their sand trays, what comes to mind that maybe there's an element of grandiosity for this person. So please notice the use of word may. I would take all interpretations with a pinch of salt. These are not facts. These are possible associations, and it's certainly not anything to share with a client unless you are absolutely certain that it's going to be safe and appropriate. So symbols positioned on the edge of the sand tray may sometimes represent the observing ego, the part of us that's just having that wide perspective, that's a bit neutral, impassionate, observing what's happening in the tray. Flying animals, vehicles, other flying beings, feathers may well be associated with the qualities of the element of air, and we will talk about the 4 elements in some of the future lenses. There is an element of alchemy potentially with ladders and staircases, flying birds, again flying vehicles, may be associated with the alchemical stage of sublimatio, which means rising above, gaining a bigger perspective. Looking at this particular sand tray, if you see the hummingbird that's again suspended on a hook a little bit above the sand tray, and whilst I would not make an immediate interpretation of this as an alchemical tray, the fact that there is a glass vessel as well and some lights does give me a sense and an impression that there's possibly an alchemical theme here. It is one of my own sand trays from a while ago. So never base your interpretation on just knowing that this is sometimes interpreted as that. Do use your first 3 lenses, your body, your emotions, your intuition, as part of the information to make any conclusions that you may want to make, and hold them lightly. Just some more examples of elevated symbols: the pelican on the side of the tray, the fairy on a hook on her bubble, and the steps made of books. So if you were to interpret that, this certainly does seem to be associated with status, learning, raising your status, and maybe possibly some of that alchemical quality as well. But again, as I said, please keep any interpretation light and with a pinch of salt. Hope you enjoyed this lens, and the next one we'll be working on is buried objects. We already touched a little bit upon the buried objects today, and we'll talk about them in more detail. In the meantime, you can get the full handout, 36 lenses for Witnessing Sandtrays, on the shop page of my Sand and Sound Centre website. You can also access a free 3-module course, Introduction to Sand Therapy Journeys, on my Sand Therapy Journeys website. Thank you and see you soon.